Hey everyone, Laszlo Montgomery here. My deepest thanks for tuning in to the China History Podcast. We're still talking about the history of Chinese philosophy. We now enter the fabulous 5th and 6th centuries BC, and the age of philosophy is flourishing for the first time in human history. And not just in China. Greece, Persia, India, and on the eastern shores of the Mediterranean, all over. 2 years after Confucius left his earthly form, Pericles was born in Greece. Humankind, after advancing from our most primitive stages of development to where things were in the 700s, 600s, and 500s BCE, for the first time, and again, I want to emphasize and re-emphasize, simultaneously in all these centers of human civilization, they all began to argue and debate these most fundamental of philosophical questions. I mentioned the state of Qi in Shandong province being the first place in China where the rulers began to patronize scholars and find uses for them. Thanks to Guanzhong's stewardship of the Qi state a century prior, Qi was now considered the Ivy League, so to speak, of higher learning in China. Thinkers and teachers from all parts of Zhou dynasty China flocked to Qi, where all the intellectual action was. Confucius was just one of the many scholars and teachers who made the pilgrimage to Qi. Qi State was located next door to where Confucius made his bed every night in Lu, in the southern portion of Shandong. In Chinese, Confucius is known as Kongzi. Most of you may have noticed all these z's coming as a suffix at the end of a lot of names and eponymous philosophical works. In Chinese, that's called a zuncheng. It's like an honorific or respectful term added to your surname. This zi means master. Since Confucius's name was Kongqiu, surname Kong, this zuncheng of zi was added to his surname, Kong. And we know him forevermore as Kongzi, Master Kong. That's all there is there with that. So Mengzi, Master Meng. Xunzi, Master Xun. Sunzi, the guy who wrote The Art of War, Master Sun. So let's talk about the legend of Kongzi. Probably none of this is historically accurate, but what the hey. This was the Zhou dynasty. I'm sure not a single one of you will be surprised that for Confucius, as it is with almost, but not quite everybody who came before Sima Qian, all we have for primary sources is what the record of the grand historian has revealed. And Sima Qian had to pretty much go with whatever he could glean from what Master Kong's disciples said, as well as from the Mengzi and another major work of the day called the Zuozhuan, the Commentary of Zuo. That Confucius lived has never been disputed. He ain't no Laozi. But the details are all in line with what you'd expect from this historical age. It all makes for scintillating reading, but how much of it is factual, if any? No one could know for sure. He was born in the year of the dog, was a tall, strange-looking man. His father was many years older than his mother and passed away when young Kongqiu was only 3. Not coming from money, it was an impoverished upbringing, and like many of the mothers of the sages, Madame Kong, though not much is mentioned about her, was a model of sacrifice and propriety. Confucius traced his ancestry back to Shangqiu in Song State, eastern Henan, and a tad of western Shandong. And as I said, he was named Kongqiu. 3 generations before the birth of Kongzi in 551 BCE, his family had migrated north to Lu State, southern Shandong, near the city of Qufu. That's why Qufu is so important. Confucius's birthplace, that's the location of the main Confucian temple. Duke Ai of Lu, a year after Confucius's passing, ordered the Kongmiao, the Temple of Confucius, to be built there. Still there today, 2,500 years later. It's a major tourist attraction in China as well. There are Confucian temples everywhere in China and around the world, but the one in Qufu is the main one, the St. Peter's, so to speak. Well, there's not a lot of rice in this gruel, so we can skip ahead and say that Kongzi married at 19, divorced at 23, and remained a swinging single for the rest of his days. And when his upstanding and virtuous mother passed away, Confucius dutifully mourned her for 3 years, a number purposely chosen to allow one to reflect during this period of mourning on their own first 3 years of life when they depended on their parents for their very life and survival. Time to give the years back as a sign of mourning and filial piety. At age 22, which would have been north or south of 520 BCE, Confucius began his teaching career and hung a shingle outside his residence. He had no trouble attracting students, and just as Confucius was beginning his career, over in present-day Bihar state in India, the Buddha had only just recently attained enlightenment. At the school run by Kongzi, which gained a great amount of repute in and around that part of Zhou Dynasty China, there were 3 subjects taught: history, poetry, and rules of propriety. Confucius said, quote, "A man's character was formed by the Book of Odes, developed by the rites, and perfected by music." End quote. The Book of Odes, the Book of Rites, and the Book of Music were all ancient texts that were studied during the Zhou. So successful was Confucius as a teacher, he became the first of his profession to amass as many students as he did, over 3,000. The standard curriculum that developed became known as the 6 arts, the Liu Yi. These were rituals, music, archery, chariot riding, calligraphy, and math. That traditional Chinese respect for knowledge and education, and for those who were educated, began here. Confucius, till his dying day, promoted it. He thought the best things anyone could do was to find a good teacher and imitate that teacher in their words and actions. One of his students introduced Master Kong to someone at the Zhou Dynasty court, and so began Kongzi's career in the Lu government, based conveniently in his home in Qufu. But much to Confucius's chagrin, rather than the Duke of Lu being in charge, the capital at this time was controlled by a cabal of 3 corrupt and self-serving noble families. They were called the 3 Huan families. Confucius pined for a day when the Duke of Lu's power could be restored. That Lu was controlled for the benefit of 3 corrupt and morally bankrupt families went against everything Confucius called for in his ideology. Later on, Confucius will make the mistake of meddling in these heated rivalries between the 3 Huan families of Lu, and he ended up on the wrong side of Viscount Jisun Shi, of one of these powerful 3 clans. Confucius had committed the error of meddling in politics and not keeping his mouth shut, and for this transgression, Confucius would, around 496 BCE, have to leave town and lay low for a while. But initially, when he began his stint in the Lu government in 501 BCE, Confucius was lauded for his performance, winning accolades for his honesty and integrity. By 498, Duke Ding of Lu, Lu Dinggong, made Confucius acting superintendent of public works. Again, the record states that he did many laudable things during his brief tenure. He moved on to the post of Minister of Crime. The most notable thing I read about his brief time in this post was that Confucius sentenced a man to die once. I thought this was far out, especially when you examine this through a 21st century lens. Confucius said he pronounced the man guilty because, quote, he was capable of gathering about him large crowds of men, that his arguments could easily appeal to the mob and make perversity respectable, and that his sophistry was sufficiently recalcitrant to take a stand against the accepted judgments of right. End quote. No matter which country we reside in our past history, this kind of demagoguery is something many of us have a passing acquaintance with. Again, the details of Kongzi's career in government are the stuff of legends that were written about him centuries after his passing. There are historians who dispute all of this. Once, on an official visit to the capital Luoyang, this was in 518 BCE, while Confucius was still in the employ of the Duke of Lu, he sought out an appointment with no less a personage than Laozi himself. This legendary meeting of the two greatest philosophers of ancient China was well documented in the records of the grand historian. Laozi, by 518 BCE, had already established quite a name and reputation throughout the land, and after meeting with the old master, Confucius was quite moved. When Confucius came face to face with the great Laozi and asked his advice on certain matters of ceremony and ritual, Laozi famously and cryptically replied, quote, "What you are studying and teaching now is all from ancient men who died a long time ago, and even their bones have rotted away. Those written words are in fact only their footprints, neither their shoes nor their feet, let alone what was in their minds. Don't regard their words as some sort of unbreakable dogma. Secondly, as a man of virtue and knowledge, you can have your own cart and live a luxurious life. If the time does not permit, it will be perfectly okay as long as you can manage to survive. Thirdly, once I was told of an old saying, a good merchant does not show his goods, and a man of utmost virtue is always simple. It will do you good if you cut off your pride, get rid of your greed, reduce your haughtiness, throw away some of your ambitions. It will serve your family better, and it will serve your state better if you are not too stubborn, no matter whenever, wherever, and whatever. That is all I have to say to you." End quote. Now, this puzzled Confucius at first, but this brief moment in time that he was fortunate to spend with Laozi transformed Confucius. As he reflected more and more on these words and their vague meaning, it's written in the Shi that he had said, quote, "Birds can fly, but will fall at the hunter's arrow. Fish can swim, but will be hooked by the fisherman. Beasts can run, but will drop into people's nets and traps. There is only one thing that is out of man's reach. That's the legendary dragon. A dragon can fly into the sky, ride on the clouds, dive into the ocean. A dragon is powerful, yet so intangible to us. Laozi is a dragon, and I'll never understand him." End quote. Laozi was much older than Confucius, but their lives did have some overlap, and if you read the stories or grew up with them, their paths crossed a couple times. Confucius held Laozi in the highest esteem. Remember, in the old master's lifetime, nobody was talking about Taoism or pointing at Laozi as the founder of some school of thought. Now, these vignettes of legendary meetings between Laozi and Kongzi make for great reading, but how the old master, Laozi, impacted Master Kong's thought, I can't say for sure, but that was their most famous encounter. After he returned to Lu, Confucius was forlorn to see how far his home state had fallen. The gory details of the demise of the state of Lu are chronicled in the Chunqiu, or Spring and Autumn Annals, again supposedly written by Confucius. He had simply concluded that this degradation of the state and then society at large was the kind of thing that happened in the absence of a ruler who lacked these necessary virtues. Confucius said time and again, place a ruler on the throne who was virtuous, benevolent, wise and reverent. Zhen, humaneness, and Yi, righteousness, would be this ruler's underlying qualities. And the ruler's skillful stewardship of the state and their ethical example would serve as the model for everyone to follow. And the ruler's goodness would inspire others to follow his example, and never would they be required to rely on using force or meting out punishments. To Confucius, it was essential that a ruler must be someone who emulated Yao and Shun in the simplicity of their royal court and the number of adornments they might display around the palace or wear on their person. Wealth would be equitably distributed amongst the populace. Confucius was anti-war and even anti-foreign relations. He said, be self-sufficient for all your needs, and then there will never be any need to engage in potential conflicts with those beyond China's borders. After things got too hot in Lu for Confucius, he and a bunch of his disciples packed up and left Qufu under pressure from the corrupt ruling nobles. Kongzi decided to wander the lands and seek out this leader who had those basic qualities and who would listen to what he had to say, find merit in his words, and then, presumably, hire him as an official advisor of sorts to help the ruler implement his ideology. He wouldn't return to Lu until 484 BCE. As I mentioned, there were no shortage of people like Kongzi walking the streets of China's capitals. He was just one of many learned men who went from state to state offering their consulting services. Mengzi, Xunzi, and many of the great warring states' philosophers did the same exact thing. These teachers or wise masters all had their own ideas about how everything in society should be organized, administered, and how the ruler should act in order to maintain peace and harmony in their lands and lead his people by example. And the thing for rulers to do back then was to invite these wandering philosophers to their respective states, to have these discussions about, well, from a macro perspective at least, how best to run their kingdom. For more than a decade, Confucius was one of these wandering scholar teachers. The actual number of years he was outside Lu and teaching and all these other places, it's disputed. He went from city to city, searching for his holy grail, a virtuous ruler who he could coach and advise. A few rulers he visited kicked his tires and tried him out, the Duke of Wei and others in Cai, Chen, and Song states. He also went to Chu. Either these dukes or princes weren't interested, or Confucius found them not worth his time. Why? Because they were all lost causes who lacked all the most basic virtues and qualities that were required of a sage ruler. When Confucius's travels took him to Qi State, the ruler at that time would have been Qi Jinggong, Duke Jing. A particular snippet from his time with Duke Jing concerned this other well-known story about when the Duke asked the great sage, "What makes a good government?" Master Kong famously answered him this way, quote, "There is a good government when the prince is the prince, the minister is the minister, when the father is the father, and the son is the son." End quote. I think this one actually makes the Confucian quotes top 10. When everyone knows their place and acts accordingly, you could count on a good and stable government. And with that little pearl of wisdom, let's slip the proverbial bookmark back in until another time. We're still very early in the game, so I encourage you to not start folding up the lawn chairs just yet. Please consider coming back again in part 4. You won't be sorry you did. This is Laozi Montgomery signing off from Los Angeles in America's Golden State, and I am welcoming you with open arms to come back again next time for another exciting episode cast.